He came home after dark with mud on his boots and hay on his coat that did not come from our barn. I know our hay. I had been stacking it since I was 9 years old, and I know the color of it, the smell of it, the way it clings to wool. The hay on Eli's coat that evening was from somewhere else. I noticed it the way you notice something your mind has already processed before your eyes catch up. A cold, quiet recognition that arrives without drama and sits in your chest like a stone dropped into still water. I set his plate on the table. I watched him sit down. And then, because I was 22 years old and had not yet learned all the questions a wife was not permitted to ask, I asked it. I said, "Eli, where have you been?" He looked up at me from his plate. Not with anger, not immediately. With something quieter and in some ways more final than anger. He looked at me the way a man looks at something that has made an error so fundamental that correcting it almost isn't worth the effort. And then he said in a voice that was perfectly level and perfectly cold, "That is not a question wives ask." He went back to his food. And I stood at that kitchen counter with a dish towel in my hands, and I felt the floor of something give way beneath me, not loudly, not with any violence, just the slow, certain collapse of a thing I had believed was solid. If you have been waiting for the stories that live underneath the quiet surface of plain life, the ones that were never supposed to leave the kitchen, you are in the right place. My name is Clara, and this is Amish Clara, where the truth finally gets spoken out loud. Please subscribe and tap the like button, and tell me in the comments, was there ever a question you were made to feel you had no right to ask? Because I was taught that asking the wrong question was the same as committing a sin, and I believed it for longer than I want to admit. I need to take you back before that evening, before the mud and the hay and the sentence that rearranged everything, because the ground that collapsed that night had been quietly weakening for the entire 2 years of our marriage, and I did not know it yet. I married Eli when I was 20. He was 25, the kind of Amish man that a community holds up as an example. Hardworking, quiet, respected by the older men, faithful in his church attendance, a farmer who kept his fences straight and his accounts honest. My mother called him a solid man, and in our world that was the highest possible praise, because solid meant he would not leave, he would not drink, he would not raise his hand to you, he would provide. Solid meant the life you built with him would stand. What solid did not mean, what no one thought to mention, was that a solid man could still be an absent one. That presence and provision were not the same thing. That a man could be inside your house every evening of your life and still be completely, architecturally unreachable. Our first year felt like learning a language I had not been told I would need to speak. I learned the rhythms of Eli's silences, and there were many of them. The silence that meant he was tired, the silence that meant he was satisfied, the silence that meant something was wrong but would not be named, the silence that meant I had done something incorrectly and would need to figure out what it was without being told. I learned to read him the way I learned to read the weather, by watching the small signs, the angle of his shoulders, the pace of his eating, the way he moved through the house in the evenings. I became skilled at this the way Amish women become skilled at all the invisible management of a household, quietly and without credit, and without ever being asked if the skill was something I wanted to develop. The question of where Eli went was not new on the night I finally asked it aloud. It had been living inside me for months, maybe longer, in the form of small noticings I had not yet assembled into a complete picture. He left some mornings before I woke and returned without explanation. He had errands that were never specified. He had conversations after church with men I did not know and did not recognize from our district. None of this was dramatic. None of it arrived wearing the costume of something alarming. It arrived the way most important things arrived in my life, quietly, sideways, wearing ordinary clothes, so that by the time I understood what I was looking at, I had already been looking at it for a very long time. The night of the hay was a Thursday in late October. I had been canning applesauce since early morning. The children were in bed. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and hot jars and the particular exhaustion of a day that had been too long before it was half finished. When I heard Eli's boots on the porch, I felt, underneath my ordinary tiredness, a small, specific alertness, the kind your body develops when it has been noticing things your mind has not yet permitted itself to name. He came through the door and I saw the hay before I saw his face. And something in me that had been very patiently waiting finally stopped waiting. After he said it, after that is not a question wives ask, the kitchen went very quiet. I want to tell you that I pushed back. I want to tell you that I said something clear and strong, that I held my ground, that I demanded an answer. I was 22 years old and I had been trained from birth to understand that a wife's role in a disagreement was to become smaller until the disagreement resolved itself. So what I actually did was nod. I folded the dish towel. I set it on the counter, and I went to bed before him and lay in the dark with my eyes open and my hands folded on my stomach, and I thought about the question I had been told I was not allowed to ask. In our community, a husband's movements were his own. This was not written anywhere that I ever saw. It did not need to be written. It was in the structure of everything, in the way the men gathered after church and spoke about their business while the women laid out the meal, in the way decisions about land and money and neighboring relationships were made in conversations I was never part of, in the way the question of where a husband had been would have been understood by every married woman in my district as a question that revealed more about the wife's failing than the husband's absence. To ask where he had been was to suggest that he owed you an accounting, and a wife who believed her husband owed her an accounting was a wife who had misunderstood the entire arrangement. I thought about this lying in the dark. I thought about it with the particular clarity that comes at night when there is no work to do and no one to perform adequacy for, and the only thing in the room is what is actually true. I thought, I do not know where my husband was tonight. I do not know where he was last Tuesday when he came in after 9 without explanation. I do not know the names of the men he speaks to after church, or what the conversations are about, or whether any of it has anything to do with the life we are supposedly building together. I am his wife. I sleep beside him every night. And I know less about his daily movements than I know about the neighbors 3 farms over. I did not sleep that night. In the morning, I made breakfast and Eli ate it and went to the barn, and the day moved forward the way days moved forward in our life, relentlessly and without asking whether I was ready for the next one. 3 days later, my sister Ruth came to visit. Ruth was 25, married 4 years, a woman who had arrived at a kind of careful peace with her own marriage that I had always read as contentment and was only beginning to suspect might be something else. We worked together in my kitchen, putting up the last of the season's preserves, and I told her what had happened. I told her about the hay and the question and the sentence Eli had delivered with that level, final voice. Ruth was quiet for a long time. She kept her eyes on the jar she was sealing. Then she said without looking at me, "Clara, men have their world and we have ours. That is not a cruelty. That is how it works." I said, "But Ruth, I am not asking to run his world. I am asking where he was." She looked at me then with an expression I had never seen on my sister's face before, something between sorrow and warning, and she said, "I know. And that is the part that worries me." She did not explain what she meant. She went back to her jars. And I stood in my kitchen with the smell of hot preserves around me, and the particular cold feeling of having received a warning whose contents you understand completely, even though not a word of it has been made specific. A week after Ruth's visit, I went to see an older woman in our district named Miriam. She was 63, widowed, a woman who had lived more life than most people in our community were permitted to acknowledge, and she had a quality I had always been drawn to, a willingness to let a silence stay silent until the right thing was ready to be said into it. I did not tell anyone I was going. I put the children with my neighbor, and I walked the 1.5 miles to Miriam's house, and I knocked on her door, and when she opened it I said, "I need to talk to someone who will tell me the truth." She let me in without a word. She put the kettle on. She sat across from me and she waited. I told her everything. The hay. The question. Eli's answer. The months of small noticings I had been collecting without understanding what I was collecting. Ruth's warning and her face and the things she had said that she had not explained. I told Miriam that I was not sure anymore whether I was failing at something or whether something was being done to me, and that I could not tell the difference, and that not being able to tell the difference was the most frightening part. Miriam listened to all of it. She was still for a long time after I finished. Then she poured the tea and she set a cup in front of me and she said, "I am going to tell you 2 things. The first thing is about him. The second thing is about you." She said, "In every generation of this community, there are men who understand that their wives will not ask where they have been, and who use that understanding freely. Not all of them, not most of them maybe, but enough that every woman in this district over the age of 50 could give you a name or 2 if she chose to. It is not spoken about. It is managed the way things are managed here. through silence, through the understanding that what a wife does not confirm she cannot be required to respond to, through the mercy, as it is called, of not knowing. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked her what the second thing was. She looked at me very directly and she said, "The second thing is that you asked. And that is not nothing, Clara. That is, in fact, everything." The women who were broken by this were not broken because of what their husbands did. They were broken by the years of never asking, of training themselves out of the question until they could no longer feel the shape of it. You felt the shape of it. You asked it out loud. And now you are sitting in my kitchen instead of folding a dish towel and going to bed and letting it settle over you like snow. That is not a small thing. That is the beginning of something. I asked her what it was the beginning of. She wrapped both hands around her teacup and she said, "That depends entirely on what you decide to do with the question now that you know you are allowed to have it." I drove home from Miriam's house in the thin afternoon light, and I want to tell you that I went home and confronted Eli with everything she had said, and that the truth came out, and we had a hard, honest reckoning, and the marriage became something real. That is not what happened. What happened is quieter and in some ways harder to explain. What happened is that I went home and I looked at my husband across the supper table with new eyes. Not angry eyes, not yet. Clearer eyes. The kind of eyes you develop when someone finally hands you a frame and you hold it up, and suddenly the thing you have been looking at without comprehension resolves into a shape you can name. I watched him eat. I watched him speak to the children with his ordinary patience. I watched him move through our house, through our life, through the hours of our evening with the ease of a man who has never once been required to account for himself to the person sitting across the table from him. And I thought about what Miriam had said, about the women who had been broken not by what was done but by the years of never asking, about the question I had asked and the question I was now allowed to keep asking, even if only inside my own chest, even if not yet out loud, even if the only person who could hear it was me. I stayed for 3 more years. There is more to that story, and it is not simple, and it contains things I am still putting words to. But I want to tell you what I know now that I did not know the night I stood at that counter with a dish towel in my hands and felt the floor give way. A husband who tells you that your question is not permitted is not protecting you. He is protecting something else and using your training against you to do it. The silence he is asking you to maintain is not a silence that serves your marriage. It is a silence that serves his freedom to move through the world without you as a witness to it. And a wife who asks is not failing. She is not sinning. She is not opening a door for the devil, or forgetting her place in God's design, or threatening the peace of her household. She is doing the most human thing a person can do inside a relationship. She is saying, "I am here. I am present. I am paying attention. And what happens in this life we have built matters enough to me that I am willing to ask about it even when asking costs me something." The hay on his coat was never explained. I want you to know that. I never got an answer to the question. What I got instead was something Miriam had promised and that I did not understand until much later. I got the beginning of something. The slow, quiet, unclosable opening of a woman who had discovered that she was allowed to notice what she noticed, and name what she saw, and ask what she needed to ask, and that no one, not a husband with a level voice and a final sentence, not a community with 1,000 years of silence behind it, not a theology that had been used to turn a wife's curiosity into a character flaw, not one single thing in the world she had been given had the actual authority to take that from her. Your questions are not sins. They never were. The only thing that was ever wrong with them was that someone needed you not to ask them. And that is his story, not yours. If something in this story reached inside you and touched something you have been carrying quietly, tell me in the comments. Tell me if you were ever handed a sentence that tried to end a question you had every right to ask. Tell me if you had a Miriam, someone who gave you back the permission to notice. And if you want to keep hearing the stories from behind the prayer cap, the ones that lived in the kitchens and the silences and the long nights of women who were told their questions did not belong to them, subscribe to Amish Clara. There is so much more that still needs to be said out loud. Until next time, remember this. A question a wife is not allowed to ask is not a question without an answer. It is an answer wearing a locked door, and you are always allowed to knock.